Move on to our next segment. She is Naomi Schaefer Riley, Senior Fellow at the Independent Women's Forum and a Resident Fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, Naomi, back to Bold.
Thanks so much for having me.
Naomi, what areas of the child welfare system do you think need improvement? You wrote a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently today, I think, about it. And what ways can we do this? Can we make it more improved for people who are looking to adopt children who are in the child welfare system?
Sure. Well, there are about 440,000 kids right now who are in foster care. A lot of your viewers may be aware that that number has been going up, thanks in part to the opioid crisis. Unfortunately, the areas of the country it's been most affected in are the areas that are hardest hit by the drug crisis. And so I wrote a piece that talked about what the federal government could do. It's interesting because child welfare is largely run by the states. Child welfare agencies in each state and family courts there. But the federal government does have some leverage, and we passed, I think, really two important 1990s. The first one is the Adoption and Safe Families Act, and that really put a timeline on the amount of time that kids could spend in the foster care system, going back and forth in between foster care, different foster care families, and also their biological homes. And it really said, we don't want to let these kids languish too long, especially young kids. It's really hard for them to form any kind of attachment when they're going back and forth so often. And so the Adoption Safe Families Act said if you've been in foster care for 15 of the last 22 months, the state actually has to move to sever parental rights. And unfortunately, the states actually don't follow this very frequently. I talk to many parents in my work, foster parents, and their cases can go on for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It goes on, and these kids are really just languishing in the system. It's unfortunate. The second piece of legislation we passed in the 90s, which is really important, is the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, which bars states from discriminating on the basis of race when they're placing kids with foster families or adoptive families. And this is really important because, as you know, so much of our national dialogue is about race consciousness and racial matching and that sort of thing, and this idea that only Black parents could possibly understand how to raise Black children. These kids really need safe, loving homes of any race. And the idea that we would be standing in the way of that, waiting for some kind of racial matching system, I think is really unfortunate. And so I think the federal government needs to do more to make sure that states are actually enforcing that law as well, because, again, in my interviews, I've found that it's widely flouted.
Naomi, I have a good friend, and she and her husband fostered a little boy who was born to a crack-addicted mother. The father is in jail or prison for the rest of his life for murder. The mother was in prison for either dealing drugs or just, some drug-related offense. The mother, they had this boy for a while, a long time. They got him the therapy he needed. They got him the help that he needed. He was thriving with them. They wanted to adopt him. The mother gets out of prison. This is a second-time offense with no evidence that she's not going to relapse. And they gave this child back to the mother, who didn't really express much interest in having him back. But there's a belief, I guess, that biologically the child is better off with the biological parent versus non-biological parent. And to me, it makes no sense. How do we get around that kind of law? It seems to me that there's a belief in some sort of biological predetermination that may not actually add up to what's best for the child.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it goes even beyond the nuclear family to this idea that even if you're, the second cousin who lives across the country and have never met the child before, you are a preferable placement to a loving foster parent who has been caring for that child for months, if not years. So I think, one of the things that we do need to keep in mind is the context here. I mean, the drug issue is huge. And unfortunately, we are not at a point where we understand how to get people away from addiction. And the likelihood of relapse is very large. Most of the cases that I've talked to people in involve drugs in some way or another. And I think, part of it is obviously, there's this sense when it comes to drug policy, who's it harming? But when it comes to the interaction of drug policy and child welfare, we really need to think twice about this. I mean, parents go in and out, relapse often, and we need to be concerned, especially when it comes to young children. Most of the times that kids are being removed from homes, they're being removed because of severe neglect, not actual abuse. But if you're a parent, and you think about what is the likelihood that you can safely care for a child, especially a small child, while you are high? I mean, that is really the question. And the likelihood is the answer is no. But we are so anxious to give the biological parents and relatives more and more chances because we feel bad for them. Honestly, I mean, who wants to take away someone's child? It seems horrible. But on the other hand, I think we really need to think about the child's rights here and the child's rights to, to have a stable, loving family, a stable, loving, permanent family, in order for them to grow, socially, intellectually, emotionally.
So we have a viewer comment, Gloria Hartsfield. She says, in Florida, the Department of Children and Families needs complete improvement. Have you seen anything in Florida that reflects what Gloria is saying? And then just in general, you mentioned that most of these problems are happening at the state level. Aren't the federal officials' hands tied in some respects?
So I think that Florida has tried to make improvements just like every other state, but I think a lot of times the staff of child welfare agencies is simply sometimes they have an ideological commitment to this idea of that a biological family is best no matter what, and also they have learned this commitment to racial matching. It's part of a kind of whole social justice education that they're getting when they study to be a social worker or a caseworker. So I think that is part of the problem. It's the pipeline of people who are going into this work. Part of it is just child welfare is a bureaucracy, and we all know what public bureaucracies are like. So can we improve those? I do think the federal government has some leverage here. These laws actually say there are specific provisions that say if states are not following these laws, the federal government can withhold some of its foster care funds from those states. And the federal government is actually responsible for about half of the funds that states get toward foster care. So I think we actually have quite a bit of leverage to try to make sure that kids get into these stable, loving homes faster, and to make sure that it's without issue with that race is not the issue when we're trying to make these places.
No, absolutely. Money definitely talks. So real quick, last question for you, Naomi. I always hear about this long line for adoption that people are, parents are just, hungry, starving for a child. A lot of times they have to go abroad. Why is there a mismatch, it seems, between all these children who are in the foster care system and these parents who are looking to adopt a child?
Well, a lot of the kids who have been in the foster care system for a long time tend to be older children. They tend to be children who are part of sibling groups, or they tend to be children who have some kind of challenges, behavioral challenges, emotional challenges as a result of what they've experienced already. And so a lot of times when you hear about the line of people waiting to adopt, they're waiting to adopt, an infant, and they're waiting to adopt a child who has no issues. They're waiting to adopt a single child. And so, one of the things that I think is really important is that there are increasingly groups of people, particularly in faith-based communities, that are open to these children who are older, who are part of sibling groups, and who have these challenges.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Naomi Schaefer Riley, and thanks for all your work.
Really important
Thank
work,
you.
Naomi.